just wanted to make sure I'm the only person showing up on the video. That way, everyone else has plausible deniability, I guess. Um, okay, so this is the third of our four-part kind of high holidays oriented Thinking Tuesday sessions. And so this one is entirely focused on Kol Nidre because there's a lot there and because it kind of gets its own service. And it's a thing that I think a lot of people end up feeling like it's not the high holidays if Kol Nidre is not a thing that they hear. Um, so we'll talk about it. Last time, I'm kind of recapping. Last time we took a look at the hows and whys of blowing the shofar and um, the context in which it happens and some of the rules that govern how long you blow the shofar for and when and how many times per service. Um, and we kind of talked about how if you were to walk into an Orthodox or maybe a conservative synagogue, you would find shofar blowing to be a much more restrained activity, that there's usually only one person who blows shofar, that they are focused on exactly how long they are blowing the shofar for in each of its various notes. And that non-Orthodox and sometimes non-conservative synagogues um, put a little more show into it. But the point of that extra show is kind of amplifying the impact of blowing shofar for people for whom following all of the details of traditional Jewish law is just not as important. And we looked at how we use the shofar at Mahar, and one of the things I kind of missed saying was that on Rosh Hashanah, the kind of if you follow the traditional pattern that's in the Machzor, where there's several different places where the shofar is blown, by the time you get to Tekiah Gedolah at the end of Rosh Hashanah day, um, you've had 100 different blows of the shofar, and we're closer to 20 because we're not trying to meet all of the requirements of Jewish law for how many times you're going to blow the shofar and which notes and which order. Even though we do kind of tend to follow the order as it's been handed down traditionally. So that's kind of what we covered last time, and we talked about how all of that happens during the Amidah, or most of it does. There is a chunk of shofar blowing toward the end of the Torah reading service, but it mostly happens during the Amidah, and it's really the Amidah that makes Rosh Hashanah look the way it does. And that's largely true for Yom Kippur as well. Um, Today we'll talk about the origins and the history of the text of Kol Nidre and why it kind of still remains controversial. Not everybody is a fan of Kol Nidre. Some of the musical backstory, um, how the chanting kind of fits into the broader context of the Yom Kippur evening service and how we deal with it at Mahar. Because one of the things that um, you'll discover once you know what you're looking at in a traditional Kol Nidre service, and when you look at the Mahar Kol Nidre service, is that we actually do a lot of the little individual steps that are part of making Kol Nidre work in a more traditional context. We actually kind of do a lot of those. It doesn't look exactly the same, but it is definitely there. So that's kind of what we'll focus on. And we'll get a chance to kind of compare what an Ashkenazic Kol Nidre chanting sounds like as opposed to a Sephardic, because in our heads we hear the Kol Nidre melody that we're accustomed to, and we think, well, that's what everybody uses. But in fact, in the Sephardic world, that's really not what anybody uses. Um, and maybe if we've got a little extra time, I can show you a little bit more of the Sephardic service because there are a lot of practices related to things like fundraising that you would never see in an Ashkenazic synagogue. And you would never see it like a Reform synagogue or a conservative synagogue, and certainly not a Mahar, but you will see them at Sephardic congregations. So it's kind of this thing that a lot of people don't know happens, or you hear about it and you say, oh, I can't imagine what that looks like. And it really is the rabbi acting as an auctioneer, which is very interesting to see. But that's kind of if we've got some time, we can kind of rewind a little bit in that particular video. So, history and basic meaning of Kol Nidre, right? We're really not going to talk about the broader evening service that Kol Nidre happens in. I mean, we could, but it's not terribly interesting. Most of it is made up of confessional texts, right? So the stuff that keeps showing up during Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that's really kind of what's the rest of the service. So first things first, what does it say? And so the Hebrew, well, it's actually mostly Aramaic is on the one side, and then the translation is on the other side. And so it says all vows and prohibitions and oaths and koname and kinuye and the like. We'll come back to what those are. That we may vow or swear or consecrate or prohibit to ourselves from this Yom Kippur until the next. And there are other versions of this that read from last Yom Kippur to this one. That would benefit us. We repudiate them all. All of them are undone, abandoned, canceled, null and void, of no force and no effect. Our vows are not vows, and our prohibitions are not prohibitions, and our oaths are not oaths. So, this is kind of the equivalent, the Yom Kippur equivalent of like making a promise and crossing your fingers behind your back. Um, so one of the things to kind of think about is, does it really mean all vows and prohibitions and oaths? Even if you say ones that would benefit us, is that really all of them? Is it every promise that you make? Is it every contract you sign? Or is it limited somehow? Um, and then we get vows and prohibitions and oaths and koname and kinuye and the like. And what the heck does all of that mean? They've used every word for oath or vow that you could possibly think of in Hebrew or in Aramaic. So a neder, nidre is the plural for neder. Neder is a kind of oath. Oops. Uh, SRA. So asar means to bind yourself or to bind something. So this is another one. Harame are prohibitions. So the word that it's coming from for Hebrew would be harem. Harem is a writ of excommunication. So making something a harem puts it off limits to you. Koname and kinuye and kinuse, they're Aramaic words. We're not actually 100% sure what kinds of oaths these are. And then Shavuot is a Hebrew word. It's not Shavuot like the holiday, although it does share a three-letter root, Shin Bet Ayin. Um, this is yet another kind of vow. There have been efforts to kind of parse apart what exactly what's the difference between a neder and um, a harem versus a shavua, and you can go way, 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 way into the weeds, but basically, we're not so worried about exactly what kinds of vows these are, and I'll explain why we're not so worried about it in a little bit. Um, and you can see that there's this from Yom Kippur, this Yom Kippur to the next, and that there's another version, so typically called the Sephardic version, that runs from last Yom Kippur to this one. So one of them is prospectively invalidating a whole bunch of different kinds of oaths, and the other one is in retrospect saying if I drop the ball, it's okay. I'm cleared for the year. Um, and then all of them are undone and canceled, abandoned, whatever else. Most of this is in Aramaic. So we actually get the Hebrew alphabet that we use from Aramaic. It's not the Hebrew alphabet. It's really the Aramaic alphabet. And Jews went into exile in 586 BCE after the temple was destroyed and picked up this alphabet, brought it back with them, and were Aramaic speakers because they lived in Babylon for, 2 or 3 generations. So most of this is not just written in what we call the Hebrew alphabet now, but is really originally the Aramaic alphabet. Um, so not only is it kind of written in that alphabet, but most of it is not Hebrew. Um, there is really, there's a couple of phrases, and that's kind of it in terms of what's in Hebrew. Um, and so we noted that there's 2 versions depending on future vows um, or past vows. There's no context provided. So this is just a text sitting there in the middle of nowhere that just, okay, we're going to invalidate all of these oaths and vows that people have made. And it's a very kind of quirky thing. And then we saw that the vocabulary is very repetitious. Vows and prohibitions and oaths and these other things that we know are some kind of vows, but we're not really sure. They don't actually fall into any of the standard legal categories. This Kinu Koname and Kinuye and Kinuse, they're Aramaic words. There's not an equivalent in Hebrew. Um, I have a I have a volume called Encyclopedia Halachtit, the Encyclopedia of Jewish Law. It's all in Hebrew, but what it is basically an index to Jewish law. And none of these, Koname and Kinuye and Kinuse, none of them appear in uh, Encyclopedia Halachtit. So they're words that are being used, but they're not really connected to Jewish law. So what's going on here is an interesting question. But you can see there's a lot of repetition. All of them are undone, abandoned, canceled, null and void, of no force and of no effect. So if you stop to think about the language in wills, for example, wills will often use some pretty repetitive language to kind of get across this thing is being given to this person. And that's kind of what's going on here is how do we cover all of the bases? We're going to say every possible word for vow or oath we can think of, and that should take care of it. I mean, that's really kind of what's going on here. Um, but an important question to ask about the text is what is it? Because when we look at a prayer book or we look at the book that we use at Mahar for the high holidays, there's lots of poetic stuff and there's songs and they're communicating moral values or something like that. And this is different, right? This is a text that says, my promises don't matter anymore. When this is a holiday where, in theory, we should be upset that we're not fulfilling our promises. And this one says, don't worry about any of your promises. So it's very odd when you stop and think about it, even to have this kind of thing in Yom Kippur. This like, okay, well, if I don't fulfill these, it's fine. Don't worry about it. That's odd for a holiday that's really kind of focused on, you know, being guilty of stuff. So is it a prayer? Not really. Is it a legal text? Maybe, but we saw that it uses words that don't seem to have any actual legal meaning that we could find. Is it an agreement? Not really. Is it a disclaimer? Maybe. If somebody hears you say it, do they know that you don't mean the promise that you make to them? Right? That's a really significant question. And it's a question that comes up um, for Jewish communities throughout time, deciding whether they even want to use this thing on Yom Kippur Eve. Do we want to recite Kol Nidre because we know what it says? We know what the language means. What does it look like to say that? What does it look like to people who aren't Jewish if they see us say that? Oh, so Kathy asks, hasn't it been used against us? Yes, it has. Right, and Arlene says, and then we go on to accept responsibility for the sin, but maybe you didn't sin if you kind of like say Kol Nidre and then you violate your break your promise. Maybe you didn't sin. It's an odd thing to kind of think, oh yeah, we're going to recite a text that doesn't actually, um, doesn't it just doesn't really make us accountable for some of the things that we say. So it's a very quirky thing when you kind of stop and think about what's going on. So we don't actually know ex exactly when people started using this text. So this first bullet point says a letter from Rav Natronai, an 8th century rabbi living in what is now Iraq, indicates that something like Kol Nidre existed by the 700s, but there's no mention of it beforehand. So the Talmud does not talk about Kol Nidre. Talks about many, many other things dealing with Yom Kippur, talks about many, many other things dealing with what gets said in a synagogue. Kol Nidre is not known to the Talmud. Um, the Aramaic itself is not clearly from any one place. And I'll explain what that means in a bit. Um, Seems more like Palestinian Jewish Aramaic than anything else. Aramaic gets used in so many places and by so many people that it turns into these weird little dialects that are particular to the place and particular to the group speaking it. So there is still a dialect of Neo-Aramaic that is used in a small number of villages in Syria and Iraq. There's a Christian version and a Jewish version of that. So Aramaic is, it's a global language. English is a global language, and the way English works in Bangalore is really not quite the same as the way English works in Washington, D.C., which is not the same as it works exactly in Minnesota and things like that. Same thing here. There become these little divisions, and you try to figure out who wrote this. It's missing some characteristics of Aramaic that's used in other areas. Its earliest direct use is in the Siddur Rav Amram. So this is really Siddur Rav Amram is the very first Siddur that anyone has a copy of. The original manuscript for this Siddur is lost, but it was reproduced enough and reprinted enough that there are a couple of different versions of it floating around. But we know that this is really the first Siddur, and it's not just a Siddur, but it's got comments dropped throughout. And so this Siddur had the stuff for Yom Kippur in it as well. And it has Kol Nidre. It has it all in Hebrew. That's not actually terribly unusual. There are versions of it hanging around in Hebrew in other places in the world. And Rav Avram, nevertheless, he includes it and he says this is a foolish custom. Um, Not even a we're worried about people holding us accountable for things we don't mean kind of custom, but just what do you think you're doing here kind of a custom. So of we don't have an original version of Kol Nidre, and we don't have an original manuscript of Siddur Rav Amram either. I think the oldest manuscript of that is mid 1200s, something like that. So Miriam says, doesn't it does it allow us to acknowledge our fallibility and encourage us to reach for more? I guess, but lots of the rest of the Yom Kippur service does that too, and Rosh Hashanah for that matter. Um, so we don't actually need Kol Nidre to do that for us. So that's yet another question. It's like, how does this thing keep going that we continue to use it? Har has Kol Nidre, right? So what's going on here with this text that isn't really a prayer and isn't actually terribly uplifting? It's an unusual thing when you stop and think about it. Um, so to just rewind to the text for a second, um, one of the ways that we know that this is probably Jewish Aramaic that was used in the land of Israel as opposed to Babylon or someplace like that. Um, a good way of making this comparison is by looking at something like a traditional Kaddish, where you get words like Shemaiah, which Shamayim in Hebrew is heavens, Shemayin in Aramaic is also heavens, Shemaiah is the heavens. We don't have any of that. So we have Nidre, where you might expect Nidraya, SRA, where you might expect SRIA. Not having that Aya ending is a really good sign that this is not from um, the Jewish communities in Iraq, because the Jewish communities in Iraq put that Aya thing at the end of every plural. It's not here. We have things like kulhon, these own endings in the Aramaic spoken in Iraq. It's the nun, these final nuns, these end sounds are dropped off ordinarily. The end sounds are here. That's another good sign that it's probably from the land of Israel, right? So there are these little specific things about how plurals are formed and um, how verbs are formed and what's going on at the end of the words and things like that that give us some clues if you know the languages to be able to figure out, okay, this is not from Iraq, this is probably from the land of Israel, which kind of makes it ironic that the first mentions we have of it are from rabbis outside the land of Israel. That this text somehow finds its way in, and they have to deal with the consequences of something that's post Talmud and concerning to them. So, I mean, they find this kind of text worrying because they don't want you to fool around with your oaths, and Kol Nidre looks like it lets you do that. So, we have a sense for where this is from. We have a sense for more or less when, somewhere between 500 and say 750. But beyond that, we don't really know. We know more or less where it's from, and we know that we went through multiple versions and that sometimes it shows up in Hebrew. Um, and the choice of language has interesting consequences for what you can do with this text. We'll get to that in a little bit. Um, right, we'll get to it right here. So why Aramaic and not Hebrew? The Babylonian Talmud, there's several places where the Talmud repeats itself. And this is one of the things that this appears in a tractate called Sotah and then in other places. The Babylonian Talmud says that when you pray alone, the ministering angels convey your prayers to God, and the angels don't understand Aramaic. Which means if you want to pray in Aramaic, you have to do it in a community of more than 10 people, because apparently that's the only way God pays attention. I'm not making this up. This is what the Talmud says about this. Um, and by the 5th century, most Jews wouldn't have spoken Hebrew or really read it with any understanding. And Hebrew and Aramaic are close, but they're not. If you speak Aramaic, you can't understand Hebrew. And if you're a Hebrew speaker, you can't really understand Aramaic. You can kind of fudge it when you look at things in writing, but you really don't know the other language. It's not like if we were to compare Ukrainian and Russian, for example, there's an awful lot of overlap so that Ukrainian and Russian speakers can mostly understand one another, even though speaking Ukrainian and speaking Russian are not the same. Aramaic and Hebrew do not share that kind of a close relationship. They're related, but they're not mutually intelligible. That's the word used in linguistics to describe that relationship between languages. They're not mutually intelligible. So when you put it in Aramaic, it's really in Aramaic, and it really isn't interpretable if you only know Hebrew. So apparently the angels know Hebrew and they know every other language because you can pray in any other language, according to the Talmud, by yourself, and the ministering angel will take the prayers and send them upward, unless you do it in Aramaic, and the angels don't understand Aramaic. I'm not making this up. I don't really understand. It's not obvious to me why they make reach this kind of conclusion. But what ends up happening is if you have an Aramaic text in a prayer book, it's really not supposed to be recited if you're by yourself. So it has there's this odd little thing to think about for everyday people who are in the process of mourning or a yard site comes around. Technically, you don't recite Mourner's Kaddish alone because it's in Aramaic. And you reciting the Kaddish doesn't do anything because your ministering angel doesn't understand Aramaic, right? And I know we probably there's probably a little bit of like, I cannot believe that this is in the Talmud. What? But it's there. It starts off in a conversation that's really about whether someone has to be able to understand a particular thing they're going to say that has legal effect, and we go down this road about whether angels know Aramaic. How do they know every other language but not Aramaic? I don't know. But if it's in Aramaic, it means that you have to have 10 people, which means that you have to be in a community of 10 or more people in order to, according to Jewish law, in order to be able to recite Kol Nidre. If you have 9 people, you're out of luck. There are some customs that say if you have a Torah scroll, you can count the Torah scroll. That's really fudging it. Um, it really is. This is in Aramaic. You need 10 people. And we're going to see that it actually starts to make a lot of sense as to why you need a bunch of people around for this particular purpose, for doing Kol Nidre, that you really do need a community around for it. Um, we talked a little bit about this. Why is it so repetitive? With all of these different vows and all of these things that we pledged not to do, and all of these things that we're finding 5 different ways of saying null and void. What's going on? Um, Encyclopedia Talmudite, which I do not own because it's many, many volumes, um, has a 30-page article in small print Hebrew, very small print Hebrew, about the various types of vows in Jewish law. And it doesn't know what to do with some of these words because they're not Jewish law categories. So the example is, why do English language wills often say, I give, devise, and bequeath? So if you were to go talk to a legal writing professor at a law school and say, we'll say, I give, devise, and bequeath, that professor's eyes are going to roll all the way back in their head because you don't need to say all of that in a will. Give is good enough. In fact, you want to say give and you don't want to use these other 2 words because they mean something specific. Just say give. That's enough. No will has been invalidated because the will says give instead of devise or bequeath. Not No modern will has been invalidated for that. So why do it? It's like covering all the bases. So why say all of these vows, these different forms of vows and different things that we're doing to invalidate them? We're covering all the bases. Just in case I made some kind of a vow that I don't remember, or I'm going to make some vow I don't remember. I'm going to invalidate everything I can think of. It's really what's going on with the repetition of the words. And so it really is at least attempting to be a legal text. It kind of has the style of a legal text written by somebody who is not a lawyer, right? It's like, how do I say every possible thing I want to say in order to just make the thing work? That's kind of what's happening with Kol Nidre, in terms of this kind of repeated language. We see people do this. If you've ever looked at court filings from pro se, people who are representing themselves, litigants, you get stuff like this all the time. They say way more than they need to because they don't really understand that you don't have to say as much as you're saying, but you want to cover your bases. So that's really what's happening here. Um, and at least prior to around the 1200s, most rabbis who encountered Kol Nidre did not like it. So whoever drafted this thing probably wasn't a rabbi because none of the rabbis liked the idea of Kol Nidre. So who would have written this thing? Probably not a rabbi, maybe a scribe or somebody like that who has some knowledge of language, but rabbis wouldn't have written this thing. So it's not, it's kind of a thing that comes in because people want it, as opposed to we do this because there's some deep reason within Jewish law that on Yom Kippur we want to invalidate a whole bunch of different vows. This exists because people are nervous. That's really why we have Kol Nidre at bottom and why it hangs on, even though we have all of these people, right? We have Rav Amram who says this is a foolish custom. We have Rav Natronai, who is about 100 years before Rav Amram, who also doesn't really like this practice. He's been asked about it in in the particular place where discussion of it pops up, and he really says this is we shouldn't be doing this. So rabbis don't like it. Eventually, rabbis like it, but because they just sort of accept that this is a thing we have to do, people will not. People won't go without Kol Nidre. So it's this very successful sort of text because it does reflect people's nervousness, but it probably doesn't actually do anything in Jewish law, which is kind of funny when you stop and think about we put this thing into a service. A lot of people call the Yom Kippur evening service the Kol Nidre service, and it might not do anything, which is kind of interesting. Um, so the rabbis kind of didn't like it. And over time, what you get are changes to the text to deal with looking forward versus looking backwards. Um, Something called the Babylonian Compromise. So these rabbis who are in what is now Iraq in the medieval period, um, in Jewish circles, this area was continued to be called Bavel or Babylon because that's where Babylon was. Um, no one lives in the city that was Babylon, but Babylon is still there in the desert of Iraq. Um, if I remember correctly, it's not terribly far from Fallujah. So this area where, the US spent 20 years at war also happens to be the area where um, the Babylonian Talmud comes from and where um, a significant amount of the early framework for what becomes kind of eventually Orthodox Judaism is all from this area because that's where the major rabbis were. And so this Babylonian compromise says, okay, look, it can't be all vows. You can't just walk into a synagogue, the feeling is, and say every vow I make, every promise, they are all invalidated. So they go, okay, personal religious vows. So, what is a personal religious vow? A personal religious vow would be something like, I promise. You kind of have to invoke God's name when you do this. Otherwise, it's not the right kind of vow. You go, God, if you do XYZ thing for me, I promise that I will go to synagogue the every day for the rest of the year. That's what Kol Nidre covers in Jewish law, is this kind of very personal, very limited sort of thing. When you start making promises to other people, Kol Nidre stops working in rabbinic law. Um, and we eventually get Moshe Isserles is writing in the late 1500s, um, in his Ashkenazi emendations to the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, Shulchan Aruch is at this point the major code of Jewish law. It's written in the mid to late 1500s by a rabbi who wrote a much larger work, in the Shulchan Aruch who's actually like the distilling down of his work. He is a Sephardic rabbi. He lives in Tzfat, um, which sometimes is called Safed, Safed. He is a mystic. He writes this legal code, and it's pretty good, except it's Sephardic. So Moshe Isserles, who is living in what is now Germany, writes up a set of edits to the Shulchan Aruch. And so if you read the Shulchan Aruch, if you know how to read it in its original, you're reading along and then you see smaller text, and the smaller text is Isserles saying, okay, but in our part of the world, this is what we do instead. And so Isserles kind of puts in, if you want to do this, if you want to use Kol Nidre to annul these personal religious vows you're going to make, you have to annul the vows aloud in advance among other people, which is why Kol Nidre is recited in community. And the Alter Rebbe, who is the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, so Menachem Mendel Schneerson was the seventh, Alter Rebbe is the first. The Alter Rebbe wrote a book called Shulchan Aruch Harav, so it's the Alter Rebbe's legal code. Says you need to recite Kol Nidre to yourself quietly enough to not interfere with the singer reciting Kol Nidre, but also loudly enough that the people next to you know that that's what you're doing. So this is also sort of the volume that you are in Jewish law supposed to use when you are praying in a communal setting. You don't want to overpower the person who's leading it. You want to make it sufficiently audible that people can tell what you're saying. And the idea here is, if you're not doing that, maybe you're just mumbling to yourself and you're not actually reciting the words on the page. So that's what happens with Kol Nidre eventually, is the expansive nature of that text, all vows, all of them, within Jewish law starts to be limited. And first it's time constraints shift. And then what kinds of vows it talks about gets limited drastically. And then you have to start saying it aloud, and you have to start saying it aloud in community so other people can hear you. And when you start to do that, Kol Nidre starts to have less and less effect. And that makes the rabbis more secure feeling about the idea that you might be reciting a text that says, my promises are irrelevant. I invoked the name of God and it doesn't matter, right? That's the thing that they don't want. They're much more concerned about that than they are about, oh my gosh, Christians will hear us reciting Kol Nidre and they will conclude that we are not reliable for keeping our promises. Christians did do that. Rabbis were worried about it, but that wasn't the main thing. So Arlene asks, what vow are we talking about? any vow, right? So Kol Nidre lists all of these different kinds of vows. So a vow is always addressed and kind of invokes the God of Israel. That's always part of one of these vows. But it could be a vow for almost anything until they start limiting it. So this is any kind of vow that you might make to yourself. Um, God, if you cure my cancer, I will go to shul every day. That's a vow. You've made a promise. It's binding upon you. You've invoked God's name and you've actually made the promise to God, right? That's what's happening in that vow. That's an example of a vow that Kol Nidre might cover. An example of a vow that Kol Nidre would not cover is standing in front of the president of a synagogue, looking at the president of the synagogue and saying, I am giving you my word. I'm making an oath in front of you and in front of God that I'm going to donate $1,000 to the synagogue this year. That's also effectively a vow, but you've made it to another person. So Kol Nidre doesn't cover that, right? It's like any promise that you can think of, you have to put through this. Does it fall under Kol Nidre? So it's not any one vow, it's a whole bunch of possible vows. I will remember to put on tefillin every day, something like that. Um, so before we kind of move on to the next section, we have questions about this one. Right. So Arlene says promises between a person and God. Yeah, that's what Kol Nidre covers. So it covers those kinds of things. It covers promises you might make. So Miriam says, what about vows to yourself? Yeah. So you could, that's exactly the kind of thing that they say, yeah, that Kol Nidre can cover. So it's not a vow that Jewish law is worried about as a vow per se that Kol Nidre would cover, unless you're invoking God. You don't have to promise it to God, but you have to invoke God. So I swear on God's name that I am going to go to synagogue every day in the coming year. We're good. It's a vow. It invokes God. It's a promise to do a particular thing that you've made to yourself. Falls under Kol Nidre. But that's like the only kind of vow that they really want you trying to annul because it doesn't really affect anybody but you. Once it starts to affect other people, it becomes far too unpredictable to allow people to just kind of like recite Kol Nidre at the beginning of the year. Do your contracts not matter anymore? What does and what doesn't matter by having this Babylonian compromise, you kind of limit it only to the vows that you make to yourself. Other questions? Okay. So put in context, making it permissible to pray among sinners. The issue becomes, or one of the issues becomes, okay, so we have this Kol Nidre thing, and Kol Nidre gets recited, and we're all bad people. So how do we set it up so that we can annul vows safely and appropriately when we have all done bad things over the course of the year? This is a concern for the rabbis. Like, we don't want people just doing whatever. So how do we make Kol Nidre meaningful and matter in the way that we want it to, um, while also recognizing that people are pretty imperfect? And so the goal for when you recite Kol Nidre is that you want to start the first repetition of it just before sundown. There are usually 3 repetitions of Kol Nidre, and the idea is if you get the one in right before sundown, the thing that happens right before that is the community authorizing itself to pray with sinners, right? That's the traditional framework that you find in an Orthodox machzor, or even it even happens in Reform and conservative machzors. They all kind of follow the same pattern of, okay, we're going to give ourselves permission to pray with sinners. That actually gets repeated 3 times, and then they roll into Kol Nidre and repeat Kol Nidre 3 times. The problem is you cannot run a court on Shabbat. And Yom Kippur is Shabbat, right? We don't necessarily stop to think about that, but when you look at Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, which, right, we talked about in the Torah, Rosh Hashanah is not called Rosh Hashanah, it's called the Day of Alarm. When you look at those holidays and you look at Sukkot and Passover and Shavuot, they are all called either Shabbaton, or just Shabbaton. And that makes it clear that whatever the Shabbat rules are, no productive work, that holiday has those characteristics. So Yom Kippur has the characteristics of Shabbat, and a court meeting to make decisions can't happen on Shabbat. It's a violation of Shabbat rules. So if you start Kol Nidre just before sundown, all of this stuff where you convene a court and say, we're going to allow ourselves to pray with sinners happens before Yom Kippur. So it's okay to do it. So the timing becomes an issue, and it's viewed as such an important thing that says men wear talit to the Kol Nidre service in many places. Um, and I mentioned here that a talit is almost never worn at night because the purpose of the fringes is that you look on them and they remind you of the commandments. So for the rabbis, the idea was we do not wear a talit at night because it's dark and you can't see the fringes. They had torches and they had gas lights and things like that. They knew that you could see that stuff, but from their perspective, it's dark. If you walk outside, you can't see the fringes. So, okay, we don't wear talit at night. Except the custom developed on Kol Nidre because of how important the holiday was, and because the beginning of the Kol Nidre service is a court proceeding. So the way that this works, the entire pattern is in this slide, which I know the text is small. So in some congregations, there's this long series of personal prayers that people come into the synagogue and they start reciting these prayers. Um, you will find these in Orthodox machzors. You will not find this in the conservative movements stuff, for example, and you definitely won't find them in the Reform movements materials, and obviously not in humanistic Jewish materials. It's about 7 or 8 pages of Hebrew. Um, so a lot of people don't recite them. A lot of people have no idea, go through their entire life and have no idea that these prayers in this top bullet point even exist. Because if you never go to an Orthodox synagogue and you never look at an Orthodox mosque, or you have no reason to know that these prayers even are in existence. So, okay, maybe you do this, maybe you don't. In an Orthodox synagogue, you very well might. Um, so once that happens, the actual service begins. And it starts with two people coming onto the bima, like the stage, um, each holding a Torah scroll and standing on either side of the person leading services. So in a lot of places, the rabbi's standing in the middle, and then you've got a couple of other people who are holding Torah scrolls. And the leader recites a line from Psalm 97, Or zaru alat tzaddik uli yisrael simcha. Light is sown for the righteous, for the person of just heart joy. And then the leader then says, with the agreement of the omnipresent and the agreement of the community in the council of heaven and the council on earth, we are permitted to pray with sinners. So this is with the knowledge of the omnipresent. The word used is hamakom, which makom in Hebrew just means place, but hamakom is often used to refer to the God of Israel because the God of Israel is supposed to be everywhere and all knowing. With the agreement of the community in the council of heaven, the word here used for council is not what we typically use in Hebrew for council. So the typical word for in Hebrew for council is vad. Vad is not what's used here. The word used is actually yeshiva. So in the council of heaven is actually b'yeshivat hashamayim, and the council on earth is uv'yeshivat haaretz. So it's legal academy, right? It's not a oh, it's some committee or something. It's like this is a legal academy, a yeshiva. So you get these lines recited. They some of them get recited three times. Kol Nidre is chanted three times. After Kol Nidre, the whole congregation repeats three times, and the entire congregation of the children of Israel is forgiven, as is the stranger who dwells among them, for the entire people sinned inadvertently. So for inadvertent sins, you get forgiven on Yom Kippur, as long as they're not too bad. That's the idea. The leader then asks for forgiveness separately. The congregation repeats what the leader said three times, and then recites a verse that is God forgiving the people in the book of Numbers. And then you say Shehecheyanu, right? This blessing that marks unusual events. You recite Shehecheyanu, you put the Torah scrolls back in the ark, and you close the ark. And then you go on with the rest of the service, which has a lot of Avinu Malkenus and confessions of wrongdoing and viduyim. Those are confessions, and al chet, right, for the sin I sinned by doing this, the sin I sinned by doing that. So there is a pattern to all of this, and the pattern is intended to kind of create in front of the congregation a beit din, a rabbinic court, which is why there's three people. You have the rabbi, and you have two people with Torah scrolls on either side of the rabbi. They are the court that then says it's okay to pray with people who are sinners and we forgive each other. So the value of this is actually not necessarily Kol Nidre itself, but is the broader communal value of we're all coming together, we're all looking at each other as a community and realizing we've all messed up and we need to kind of ease off and recognize that a lot of the things we do to each other are inadvertent. We can't even itemize the things we do to each other. We just have to forgive each other so that we can move on with the process of atonement, and so that we actually can become reliable enough in legal terms to annul certain kinds of promises we might make in the future. That's the broader scheme of what's going on. So why three? We have a lot of three. We have three repetitions. We have three people in the rabbinic court. So a Beit Din always requires three people. If you know anybody who has undergone formal conversion to Judaism, that happens in the presence of three people. Um, a lot of the time, not every time, but a lot of the time, all three people on a conversion Beit Din are rabbis, but not always. It doesn't have to be rabbis. It just needs to be people who are respected within the community. And typically one of them is a rabbi because that paperwork may get forwarded to some organization or another to kind of establish bona fides for that certificate. So you have three people for the court, you have three repetitions, and Machzor Vitri, which is an early uh, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur prayer book, says the chant happens three times with increasing intensity to reflect coming closer and more intimately into the presence of God each time. Okay. There's a lot of stuff in Jewish liturgy that comes in threes when the idea is to intensify what's happening. The big one that people tend to know is not necessarily Kol Nidre and all this other stuff being chanted three times, but during the Amidah, both during the week and for Shabbat holidays, there the first blessing is always a blessing for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The second one is always an acknowledgement that God raises the dead. The third one is a blessing acknowledging God's holiness, right? That's the setup for the books. And that blessing about holiness is preceded by something called the Kedusha, which is essentially, there's several versions of it, but the Kedusha always does the same thing every time, which is it sort of reenacts one or another biblical vision of what the heavenly court would look like. So in the prophetic books, both Isaiah and Ezekiel report having visions of the heavenly court while they're at the temple. And so they report angels calling back and forth to each other. And so the structure of the Kedusha does that. And one of the lines in the Kedusha is Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzavaot, Malol Kol Haaretz Kavodo. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The entire world is filled with his glory. Kadosh is repeated three times. Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. And each time you will see people go up on their tiptoes. The idea being that they get a little closer to heaven by going up on their tiptoes. A lot of the time you see people do this by just like bouncing up and down. That's actually not, strictly speaking, what the custom calls for. What the custom calls for is each time you go up a little bit higher when you're done. So with each kadosh, you're a little bit higher, a little bit closer to heaven. That's the idea with the three. So this three thing of increasing intensity and coming closer is very common. Um, the Amidah itself starts with three blessings, ends with three blessings, and the first three blessings are how you walk yourself into, from the rabbi's perspective, they are how you walk yourself into the presence of the God of Israel so that you can credibly start to ask for stuff. And then the last three blessings are you taking your leave. So that's kind of what's going on with the threes. It's very common to kind of have these three things when you're increasing or decreasing. So why are they going through the process of granting permission to pray with sinners? And it's not that you can't pray with people who sinned. So everybody sins. They know everybody sins. The problem is that communities would excommunicate people. And they would excommunicate people who are, I have the word here is avaryanim. So an Avera is a sin. Avaryanim are people who sin habitually. It's a character trait. Um, so those are the people that you're worried about in this text, this permission to pray with sinners. And so what that all does is basically says all of these people that we kicked out of the community, if they're here, we're letting them back in because everybody has to be given an opportunity to repent. So we need them here. If they're here, we're going to lift the ban that's been put into place on them. Um, for those who are wondering what would happen to Baruch Spinoza if he showed back up in a Jewish community, and I don't know. It's very likely that they would have just chased him out of the room because we don't really know why they excommunicated Spinoza, but it was bad. And Spinoza was happy to be excommunicated, so he wouldn't have shown back up at a synagogue anyway. But the idea is we bring people back in, and Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, in commenting on Kol Nidre, talks about this letter, Maimonides' epistle or letter on martyrdom, where Maimonides encounters is posed a question: what happens if you are forced to convert to Islam or Christianity? What do you do? What's your status within the community? And he's told about a rabbi who says these people can never come back. Every time they do anything Jewish, they're just sinning more. And Maimonides is horrified, and he says, "No, that's not how Jewish law works. People come back in. We let them back in. If something really bad has happened, you maybe should move from where you live because maybe it's not safe. But by and large, he's very understanding of people undergoing forced conversions." So Rabbi Sachs is kind of saying, these are we're talking about people who underwent forced conversions. We want them back in, so we bring them back in at Kol Nidre in this way. And doing that, lifting that ban, you need a court. And that's where you get the leader plus two people with Torah scrolls on either side. Um, so before we move on, questions about that? Turns out you can get a whole lot out of like 3 pages of a Machzor if you really like work at it. So there's a lot here.
I had a question about that idea of martyrdom. I didn't really
Yeah.
know much about that, and I'm really sorry that I'm so late today. But like I didn't know like what I always think of martyrdom being in the Quran. I didn't know like we have much about martyrdom.
Yeah, we don't. So as humanistic Jews, we definitely don't talk about this much. Um, we will actually talk about it a lot next week. There are sections in the Yom Kippur service in particular, and not just Yizkor, but other sections as well, that are focused on people who died for Judaism or people who died for being Jewish. So there is actually a martyrology. It's called a martyrology, um, telling the story of 10 rabbis who were all martyred. And the text is very unhistorical. It really kind of talks about these 10 rabbis as though they were all contemporaries of each other, and they were not. And we can't even really confirm that three of them ever existed. They are only mentioned in this poem. But each of these people willingly undergoes torture and death for the sake of Jewish law. So that is pretty squarely martyrdom. We just don't talk about it much because we tend as modern Jews to do these things with our brains where we go, that's not a thing that we would do. Of course that's who does, who voluntarily does these things. Um, just like do things, you'll hear people say things like, there's no heaven and hell in Judaism. I don't know what 1800 years of Orthodox Jews would say, but I'm pretty sure they would say that those people are wrong because they very definitely have a sense of heaven and hell. So we sort of have gotten accustomed to a particular way of thinking about what is and isn't Jewish that largely is the result of early American Reform Judaism and its reforms and its changes to theology. So we don't think about martyrdom. But in the Middle Ages, Jews thought about martyrdom and recognizing that those kinds of people exist is part of what goes into the Yom Kippur liturgy and is actually a really significant part of it that happens on Yom Kippur Day. And people have no idea is there because by the time you get there, if you don't know what you're looking at, all you know is that by this point, you've probably been there for 4 or 5 hours, and we finally got to this thing, and no one ever stops to explain anything about this martyrdom, this martyrology thing. They just go into it. So if you don't know what you're looking at, you don't know what you're looking at. And these things just kind of happen around you, and we miss that really traditional Judaism is a lot different than we think Judaism is. I mean, we just don't think about these kinds of things, but they're there because Judaism has this long history. So we don't think about martyrdom, but boy, the medieval rabbis thought about it all the time.
Well, how about like the person who killed Rabin and those sorts of Jews, the kind of the extreme ones who are like think that they're doing something for everybody, but for us, but they're not really. You like in their mind, aren't they sort of feeling like we're martyr? Like I
Oh
needed
yeah.
to, go get rid of, they were going against the broader vision of what Israel. I'm saving this for the Jewish people, and like I thought like for us to understand where that mindset and how difficult it is to kind of move it, like maybe they would this is meaningful to people like that who don't mind killing a few people, killing our own because of their vision of what we should have as a people or something. I don't
Oh
know.
yeah. They folks like Baruch Goldstein, those folks take this stuff seriously. Um, like half of the current cabinet of the state of Israel right now, those people take this stuff seriously. Um, what they are thinking about and what Maimonides was thinking about are kind of two different things because Maimonides' thinking is really focused on we know that um, in the 11 and 1200s in North Africa, there were a number of forced conversions of Jews to Islam. The Islamic Empire that had initially kind of found its way into Spain in the 900s, 1000s fell away. The one that replaced it was much more religiously extreme. And so they forced Jews to convert en masse to Islam. And then these Jews would want to go back to synagogue, right? This is a thing that happens a lot with forced conversions and not just for Jews. A very similar controversy runs throughout the fourth and part of the fifth century in Christian North Africa because the Roman government still was, strictly speaking, anti-Christian for a lot of that time. So they forced certain people to convert from Christianity to Roman traditional religion. And these Christian churches had to figure out what they were going to do with people who had consumed meat eaten by who had eaten meat that was offered to idols as a sacrifice. So this is not a unique thing. It's alarmingly common in North Africa, but it also applies to Jews living in Christian regions in Europe. Um, the idea that when part of what this epistle on martyrdom is about is stuff that you may have heard about before, which is what are the limits on what you can and can't do to save your life if you are compelled to violate commands in the Torah. So that's really kind of a lot of what Maimonides is talking about, and that's where there are three things that if you are ordered to do them, you have to allow yourself to be martyred rather than commit those sins. So that's part of what Maimonides is talking about, and he doesn't include converting to Islam as one of those sins. It's idol worship, certain sexual crimes, and murder. If you are being compelled to commit any of those, you need to allow yourself to be martyred. That's kind of Maimonides' rule. But then he's also concerned about, okay, so for all of these people who did convert, how do we bring them back into the community? We don't stop to talk about this very much because it just isn't a thing that comes up, but it's very present as an issue in the Middle Ages. And it's very much an issue that some of these more religiously right-wing oriented folks in Israel, they take it seriously. So the best known melody for Kol Nidre, we'll talk a little bit about the music, right? Because that's what people like about Kol Nidre, not all of this court stuff. I think it's interesting, but I'm a nerd. Um, the most commonly known melody for Kol Nidre, the one that you hear at Mahar, the one that you hear at most synagogues, we don't know where it's from. We have no idea. The first time it appears as sheet music is in the mid 1700s. Um, a lot of people know that the German composer Bruck composed a suite inspired by Kol Nidre. Um, Kol Nidre is really a jumping off point for that. He sort of was inspired to write more. So what Bruck's Kol Nidre is not, in fact, just the traditional Kol Nidre. There's other stuff, but you will still find people perform that in synagogues because it does have the repetition three times. But this is a specifically Ashkenazic melody. There are other ones. There's Sephardic melody, which really barely sounds like the Ashkenazic one. Um, and as I said, I write the songs. Barry Manilow wrote the song I write the songs, but I don't know that he ever recorded Kol Nidre. We know that Neil Diamond and Perry Como have. So the first video we're going to look at is from the United Synagogue, which in Great Britain is modern Orthodox. In the US, the United Synagogue is United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. It's the conservative movement. The chief rabbi of the United Synagogue of Great Britain is the chief rabbi in the UK. So Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks was chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth, which made him chief rabbi for the United Kingdom, like the Jewish equivalent of the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's worth knowing that there are not nearly as many Jews as there are Anglicans under the aegis of the Archbishop of Canterbury. So let's share. Oh, I realized I didn't share it with audio. Hold on. Okay, there we go. So this is from the United Synagogue in Britain. You can tell from the date, this was the first year of the pandemic, right? So these are, there's this guy as a rabbi, there's a cantor who's going to sing Kol Nidre, and they are in different locations, and the video is spliced together.
A year of peace and a year of health. I wish everyone well over the fast and a good Yontif. Yeshiva
של מעלה ובשבעה של מטה על דעת המקום ועל דעת הקהל אנו מתירים להתפלל עם
So that was the
עבריינים
permission to pray with.
משיבה של מעלה ובשיבה של מטה על דעת המקום ועל דעת הקהל אנו מתירים להתפלל עם עבריינים בשיבה של מעלה ובשיבה של מטה על דעת המקום ועל דעת הקהל אנו מתירים להתפלל עם עבריינים כל נדרי ושרי וחרמי וקונמי וכינויי וכינוסי
In any case, they were on their second repetition by this point. So you can kind of see that you get this repetition it's a familiar tune, right? It's the same basic tune that you would hear at Machar. Um, a question that came up in the chat was, so can you do Zoom minions? And the answer is yes. A lot of rabbis have authorized it. And the way that it works is in the Orthodox world, um, when it was permitted, it's not permitted anymore, really. But exigent circumstances allow it. The way that it would work is everybody was expected to turn their computers on in advance of the holiday. Everyone was expected to have logged on to Zoom in advance of the holiday. There would be 10 people physically at a synagogue, and it would include the rabbi and the cantor and, 8 other people. And the Zoom would just be left on and it would run and services would occur. And the idea was that if you lost your internet connection, you didn't log back in because you weren't supposed to turn your computer back on. If they lost internet at the synagogue, everybody was out of luck. The people who were there would be covered. Everybody else just kind of doesn't get high holiday services. But that's how those online minions were working for Orthodox Jews in particular. And the conservative movement did a similar thing. And I remember watching the events unfold in 2020. And one of the things that we all discovered was that Zoom only worked for 24 hours. You could only sustain a Zoom call for 24 hours. The problem became Jewish holidays are not 24 hours long. Shabbat is 25 hours long, give or take, depending on the time of year. So's Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah is 24 and then 25 hours long. So Zoom didn't stay functional long enough for everybody to observe the holiday all the way through with synagogue services. So there were Facebook groups for everything, right? So there were Facebook groups for rabbis and cantors trying to figure out how to deal with all of this stuff during the pandemic. And there were lots of, our Zoom cut off in the middle of whatever. Most people had figured it out by the time we got to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur then put a huge amount of stress on Zoom's infrastructure as well. So online minions were created and they did work. No one does it anymore in the Orthodox world because, really, in the Orthodox world, people started going back to synagogues by November 2020. They were just like, we're done. We're going back to shul. So if you needed to stay home and be masked, that was okay. You had a health reason not to be following every commandment. The rest of the Orthodox world was just done by really November of 2020. And then you started to have outbreaks at Orthodox synagogues because people would come in and they'd be sick and there weren't vaccines yet, but they wanted to daven, so they went. And then you had people getting sick over and over and over and over and over again. So that wasn't an uncommon thing. So that was the Ashkenazi style Kol Nidre, which is, we've heard that tune before. This is a Sephardic synagogue in LA. Sephardic Temple Tifereth Israel. They're not affiliated with any particular movement. They're just Sephardic. And this is their Kol Nidre stream, actually from, I think, 2021, maybe, because there's a lot of people in the room and you wouldn't have seen that in 2020. So we'll hear how the music is different. I don't think we're going to end up sitting through 3 go-rounds of in the yeshiva of heaven and the yeshiva on earth. I don't think we get all of that. And you can see that there are actually just a ton of people on the bima holding Torahs. So they expand who can go up there. Oh, Toby asks, will the Mahar services be online? They will be on YouTube. If you check your email, our administrator, Jackie, actually sent out some details about how the online stuff will work, but basically it's going to be on Cedar Lane's YouTube. And then we can then download the video and do what we want to do with it, because you can actually download videos from YouTube with the right software. So let's take a listen to the Sephardic one, because it is different. Aye.
All Yisrael Shwana La Shavue
Okay. Let me see.
Ve'avar Ad Yom HaKippurim Hazeh Sheba Alenu Leshalom ומيום הכיפורים הזה עד יום הכיפורים שיבוא עלינו לשלום נדרן לנדרה ושבוענה לשבוע ונידוינה לנידויה וחרמנה לחרמה ושרנה לאסרה כולאון את חרתנה באון ירבד יאון שביתין ושביקין לשרירין ולקיימין ונסלע לכל אדם בני ישראל ולגר הגר בתוכם כי לכל עם בשגגה. Havod, Rabbi.
וישראל ושבועי וחרמי וחונמי
So what's happening here is the Sephardic cantor has done Kol Nidre with a Sephardic melody. And this is a rabbi who was trained in an American seminary doing the Ashkenazic version because they have Ashkenazi members. So you can kind of see there's like all of these different customs and ways of doing it, and it sounds different, right? That it really is not. The sounds are very, very different. Sephardic sounds are very much of the Arab world, and Ashkenazic sounds are, pretty Northern European folk music kinds of sounds. Jewish music tends to follow the pattern musically of the people living where they are. So it's, you hear the kinds of music that you hear with Havenu Shalom Aleichem, for example. Look, that's Eastern European folk music. That could as easily be a Polish folk song. So it really is, we follow the culture where we are. It's not worth pretending we don't. But I wanted to just quickly kind of pop on screen what Mahar does. So we actually have 3 repetitions of the Ashkenazi melody, but it's 3 different settings. So one of the repetitions uses the traditional Ashkenazi text, right? Annulling vows from this Yom Kippur to the next. The next one is instrumental. And most years it's Harry Appelman doing an improvisational interpretation of the Ashkenazi melody. And then the third one uses a humanistic text that actually affirms certain commitments. So it says, All vows and self-imposed restrictions and oaths not to act, and kinu ye and kinu say and the like, because we still don't know what any of those words mean, that we vow and pledge and swear not to engage in and restrict ourselves from for the sake of love and righteous action, they shall be affirmed. So if you commit to doing something or not doing something for the sake of, and it really uses the words ahava and tzedakah, if you commit to those, this is us doubling down and saying we're going to do those things. Like the traditional Kol Nidre, it's largely Aramaic. The stuff that got changed is the stuff that's written in Hebrew because, quite honestly, no one really knows how to write in Aramaic anymore. It happens in college and grad school classes when you study Aramaic as exercises. Really, no one writes in Aramaic, and they certainly don't write in this version of Aramaic at this point any longer. So that's really kind of what we end up doing, and it ends up looking a lot like what happens in those other synagogues. We actually do have some readings. They come in between different repetitions of Kol Nidre that talk about being able to be in community with people who haven't always done the right thing every time. Right? So we do have similar stuff happening in what we do on Kol Nidre. But we're obviously not talking about we're all sinners, and now we're all going to be able to pray because we've admitted everybody in who had been excommunicated, right? That's not a thing that you're going to find at any humanistic congregation, I hope. At least not ones that are associated with the Society for Humanistic Judaism. What you find in independent ones is a different story, but that's not our problem. This is what actually happens at Mahar. You will notice that we don't stand up with Torah scrolls or anything like that. We're not pretending like we have a Beit Din or any of those things, but we do have similar language that gets used to kind of convey some of the same general ideas that we've all kind of fouled things up, and we do it unintentionally, and we need to at least forgive ourselves and each other enough to be able to be in the same room and continue to work on that process of fixing relationships. So that's really what we end up doing with Kol Nidre. There are members of Mahar who think that we should not have any variety of Kol Nidre. So for some people, the list of vows is, the list of vows that are there are all religious vows. And so the thinking is, why in the world are we chanting a text that talks about these religious vows that we don't even think matter? Because even if you're a Mahar member who, when people assume that everybody at Mahar is atheist and you pipe up with, I'm not atheist, which we have members who that fits. Even though we have folks like that, it's still independent of supernatural authority. And so we have Mahar members who think we should really not be doing Kol Nidre at all. For others, and this is something that Kathy had mentioned early on, there's a history of Christians in particular understanding Kol Nidre to mean that you can't trust Jews. And so in order to not feed the fire of anti-Semitism, there are some Mahar members who think we should not do Kol Nidre. And so there are people who are members of Mahar who will not come to Kol Nidre, but will come to Yom Kippur morning. And it's not about the time of day, and it's not about driving at night. It is really about not thinking Kol Nidre should be something that happens at Mahar. For these reasons, either we're talking about religious vows, so why are we doing that? Or the kind of the history of anti-Semitism and how Kol Nidre plays into that. There are some humanistic congregations that only have an instrumental performance, or only have the humanistic version, or only have the traditional version. humanistic congregations that are very small and don't really have musicians available to them at all may play it through an iPhone. Um, it just sort of depends on what the resources are. Not everybody does it, but plenty of our congregations do. And you will hopefully never hear me sing Kol Nidre because that is not a thing I ever want to try. Um, so that's the end of the slideshow part. I noticed that Arlene asked about, particularly in those videos with Kol Nidre, you saw people wearing white clothing. And Arlene had asked, is that something that Machar does? Is that a custom that Machar has? And it's not. Um, you will find people in Orthodox synagogues and you will find people in conservative synagogues doing it, and you will find Reform rabbis and cantors doing it on the Bima. But you won't really find it happening in humanistic congregations except for the occasional person who just decides they want to follow this custom. Um, and Arlene mentioned she knows it as a Reconstructionist tradition. Reconstructionist Judaism is very interesting in some of what it does, and sort of on the surface it looks a lot like conservative Judaism, but then some of the changes to the liturgy are very radical. And then they adopt really, really traditional practices. So you have a very, very, very generally left-leaning, religiously kind of community that then does these very orthodox looking things as in an effort to kind of reclaim and reinterpret these kinds of practices. So you will find Reconstructionist congregations with wearing the white. You'll find Reconstructionist congregations who get really, really interested in traditional Jewish burial practices. So you will find Reconstructionist congregations that start up a Chevra Kadisha, the society of people who take care of deceased people's bodies. And they will wash the bodies and watch the bodies overnight and put them in burial shrouds. And so the shrouds feed up and all of the things that really only happen typically if you have Orthodox Jews around to be involved in burial practices. Reconstructionist synagogues sometimes have these people. In fact, in Columbia Jewish congregation has a member, Dave Zinner. Dave is really into these burial practices and has actively trained people, not just to do it for Columbia Jewish congregation, but for other Reconstructionist and other non-Orthodox Jewish communities in our area. So this was something that they were actually thinking of really doing large-scale training on at one point at Columbia Jewish congregation. Okay.
Rabbi, what's the point of wearing white on Rosh
Hmm.
Hashanah?
So most people don't do it on Rosh Hashanah, but they will do it on Yom Kippur if they do it. There's a couple of different ideas that are advanced. So one of them is just white is a symbolizing purity, right? That's something that a lot of cultures have. Not all of them, right? There are some cultures where white is a color of mourning or something like that. So for some, it's purity, and we're in the process of atoning. And some of the idea behind the white in that situation is when you read the Torah about what happened on Yom Kippur, the high priest routinely changed clothes and was constantly changing into white garments. And the rabbis had this story that like around the high priest's waist every year on Yom Kippur before he went into the Holy of Holies, they tied a scarlet rope. And they knew that the sacrifices had worked if the rope turned white. If the rope did not change colors, the rope was around the high priest's waist so that they could drag his dead body out of the Holy of Holies. To my knowledge, no one ever got dragged out of the Holy of Holies. Like, they don't talk about that having happened, but they talk about that idea and wearing white. a more modern interpretation of it, and I've not seen it anywhere in really traditional sources. It's definitely like a 20th century kind of thing, I think, is the idea that Yom Kippur is like a dress rehearsal for death. You don't eat, you afflict yourself, you wear white, you wear these shroud-like things. You don't wear leather, you don't, right? So it's this kind of humility thing and the long gowns and whatever else. So that is a more modern approach to understanding it. Um, the first place I remember encountering it is in Alan Liu's book, This Is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared. Um, I think the idea came from there or right around that time because it's just like the Shulchan Aruch does not have this and Maimonides does not talk about this. So it crept in the modern period as a reinterpretation of all of this white stuff. Like it's just purity. That's the whole point, right? So some people need other explanations, and I think that's really where it's coming from, is you can see, I mean, you can go, okay, it looks like a burial shroud. I get it. But that seems to be really where it's from. And then there's all of this stuff that happens on Yom Kippur in particular that you will never see at a humanistic congregation, like uh, Nefilat Apayim, which is falling down on your face, is it literally means falling on your nostrils. But what it means is the rabbi and the cantor getting down on their knees and then lying down on the ground with their faces on the ground as part of what's called the Aleinu Hagadol, the Great Aleinu. So Aleinu is this prayer about the world transforming and everybody finding God. Aleinu Hagadol is specific to Yom Kippur, and the rabbis get down on the ground and the cantor gets down on the ground, and then people come up and hold them up by their arms to pick them up so that they don't put their hands on the ground again, right? There's a choreography behind it. Most people who go to synagogues where the clergy do Nefilat Apayim don't themselves also participate. If they do, it's sort of seen as an attempt to inflate your own ego. So there is actually a joke. Of course, there's a joke where it's Yom Kippur and it's the Aleinu Hagadol, and the rabbi calls out in distress, "Lord, I'm a sinner," and he falls down on his face. And the cantor sees the rabbi do it, and he goes, "Well, I guess I got to do it too." "Lord, I'm a sinner." He falls down on his face. The president of the synagogue sees it, and he goes, "Oh, I should do that too." "Lord, I'm a sinner," falls down on his face. And the vice president looks over at the treasurer and he goes, "Look who's such a sinner." So, there's this like self-aggrandizing thing that can happen with these kinds of rituals. And sometimes they show up in Jewish jokes. Other questions?
Are these talks, the Thinking Tuesday talks, I know you're recording them, are these available online?
They
Like,
will. They will
Will
be.
you put them together at some point? And because I wanted to share them with somebody who hasn't come.
Yeah. So I keep meaning to post the other ones. There'll be Mahar has a YouTube channel. We actually have one that has adult ed stuff and then one that's mostly stuff that I've generated. Um, the one that I've generated is actually like kind of an official Mahar account. It has the logo and all that stuff. And I'll put together a playlist of the 4 sessions for this so that people can go back to it. And, when the high holidays roll around next year, I can say, hey, we had a thing about Kol Nidre, which means that I can do a thing about something else next year. I don't have to retread the Kol Nidre ground or the what's the Amidah ground or things like that. So yeah, it'll be up there.
Thank you so much. This is really
Thank you.
interesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
I always learn a lot. I always think it's really interesting. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I couldn't hear it earlier.
And
And
one of these days, I mean, next week, I'll go back to um, the fundraising bit that I mentioned. So something that happens at Sephardic synagogues that you will not see happen at Ashkenazic synagogues is during services, Sephardic synagogues will literally auction off the various honors available during the service. So the very video that we were watching earlier on, they wanted to figure out they need people to open the ark to take the Torahs out to then be able to do the in the court above and the court below bit. And so the rabbi is on the bima and he says, "We need people to open the ark. We're going to start at $1,000. Do I have $1,000? I have $1,000. Do I have $2,000? 2,000. Does anybody have 2,000? Does anybody have $1,250?" And he's auctioning off, opening the doors, and people auction off carrying the Torah scrolls on Simchat Torah and being able to have an aliyah to stand next to the person who's going to read the Torah. Like, this is stuff that's normal in Sephardic synagogues that we very frequently, those of us who come from the Ashkenazic world, look at this and go, "Oh my God, what are you people doing?" But it's
Talk
completely
about
routine.
fodder for anti-Semites.
Right. And you'll hear that in that particular part, at some point, the rabbi says, "I'm going to talk later about why it's important to support the synagogue this way." This is an Ashkenazic rabbi, right? He's probably trained at Jewish Theological Seminary or something, because you heard him singing Kol Nidre with the traditional Ashkenazi tune, because they've got Ashkenazic Jews. The Sephardic cantor doesn't know it. So this rabbi, who probably went to Jewish Theological Seminary or maybe Yeshiva University, maybe, is doing the Sephardic thing of auctioning off roles within the service. And in part, he can kind of do it when he's doing it because Yom Kippur hasn't officially started yet, right? I kind of said that the goal is to do Kol Nidre to really start it before sundown. So all of this stuff with the divine, the court above and the court below, and the opening the ark and the auctioning of that, that's all before Shabbat, before Yom Kippur starts. But it also happens during Yom Kippur, right? There's just somebody who remembers, you know, Mr. Abulafia said that he was going to donate $1,000 because we let him open the ark for the Torah service on Yom Kippur Day. Like it's just a normal part of life in a Sephardic congregation. And so it looks so different to us. But then Ashkenazic congregations have low-key ways of doing similar things. So it's very common, particularly when synagogues get larger. It's very common for you to have assigned seats for the high holidays, where they go, "You are in A15, A16, and A17. And when you get to your seat, you will find an envelope in one of those seats that is addressed to you. And inside the envelope is a card that's got pre-cut tabs. Your name's on it, and you can fold the tab for a particular dollar amount." So that part happens. And lots of conservative synagogues and Orthodox synagogues do that. And it doesn't have to be public. But then there are the synagogues where, first of all, the gabbis are walking up and down the aisle collecting the envelopes during the service. So they don't go to your chair later. They're pushing for the donation. It's not uncommon for there to be either or both, "We're not going to open the doors until we get to dollar amount X. The Torah service will not end until." The other one is, "You can ask for your donation to be read from the bima." So it goes up and the rabbi says, Phil Sachs donated 10,000, pledged $10,000 this year for the high holidays. Isn't it so generous how he supports the synagogue to encourage people to donate? Sometimes both of those things happen. You're not getting out, and also we're going to pump up donations by talking about the level of donation that's coming in and who they're from. So the Ashkenazic world has its version of this, but it tends to be a little more, we're just not letting you out of this room until we hit our dollar value. And it's not a thing that everybody does, but I know it happened at the synagogue I grew up at. Both of those things was not uncommon. Oh, the VP debate is starting soon. Okay. So go watch the VP debate. Also be aware, if you haven't seen the news alert, that Iran launched ballistic missiles at Israel today. So that happened too.
And what's the result? I haven't been on the news. I assume hopefully they were able to get them down.
Probably they were able to shoot down most of them with Iron Dome. It would be very surprising. That's not a particularly large number of missiles. I sort of imagine they probably shot most or all of them down.
I thought Bibi Netanyahu's direct address to the Iranian people was amazing. Like for him to, I don't know if you saw that, it was like in Haaretz or Times of Israel. He like had a direct speech to the people of Iran, we are with you, and I'm not, this is not about you. This is about your government that doesn't care about you. And it was very interesting.
I'll have to go find it.
Yeah.
Okay. So good night, everybody. I
Thank
know I'm
you.
going to see people on Thursday, whether in person or, on the camera.
Jeremy, do you have 1 minute for a
I
quick
do.
question?
Yeah.
So Elaine mentioned to me that, among other things, I'm going to come up at the beginning of the service Thursday and just welcome everyone. Something to that effect?
So I've actually kind of rejiggered the beginning of the service. It won't be right at the beginning. Where are my notes? Let me open the Word document that has my notes. Because what used to happen, and Elaine did this too at one point, was like Elaine would come up and say, welcome, and give a welcome message, and then introduce me. And I always thought that was just bizarre. Like, who introduces the rabbi at high holiday services? That's weird.
Yeah.
So, basically, like, I have a slot on page 2, where that would be when you would kind of come in. And so it's still, really pretty early in the service, and then, say whatever it is you want to say, honestly. That wouldn't be the talk.
Right.
That would just be, I think last year Elaine used that to mention where the emergency doors were and where the bathrooms were and things like that.
All right. So let me ask you this. So I suspect, knowing you as I do, that you will kind of give an introduction at the beginning of the service that says we're making some changes this year. I'm sure you'll notice the seating is different, and we're having a lunch that's different, and we're gonna do, I suspect you're going to do that. You're gonna, is that right? You're gonna point out that,
because
we have some changes.
People are going to be a little freaked out. Nadine and I are going into Cedar Lane tomorrow to put tape on the floor to create seating sections and things like that. It's going to be obvious.
But the reason I say that is, if you're going to do that by way of introduction, I'm trying to figure out what's left for me to say, if anything, because I'm definitely not going to get up there and point out the exits. I can tell you that. And if the answer is there's not anything left for me to say, I'm happy to just not, and because I'm going to be addressing everyone twice, right? I'm going to have my thing about why am I here that I'm excited about, by the way. I hope it goes over well. And I'll share something with you in confidence. And so I know I'm doing the announcements at the end, yeah,
Right.
and the
Yeah.
thank yous. And as a part of that, nobody knows this except Jackie, me, and now you. And I am planning to call Elaine up and thank her for her 3 years of service. And we've gotten her a gift from the congregation.
Oh,
Uh,
nice.
Prepared some remarks. I was thinking, obviously, like if we were doing adult ed, just Mahar, that'd be a natural. I would have done that then. But since we're sitting there always with two other congregations that this doesn't affect, I
Yeah.
haven't had an opportunity to do this. So I'm thinking this is the opportunity to do it.
Yeah. I think Elaine is probably the only person who's done 3 years, like ever.
Well, it's funny you should say that because I've been doing a lot of research into the history and founding of Mahar over the last couple of weeks. I've gotten lost in this deep dive, which as I was putting together these remarks, not that I'm talking about the history of Mahar in my address at all, of course, but it just got me thinking about it. And but as a part of that, Larry sent me the history going back not to the beginning, but it's got the chronology of years of president and rabbis at Mahar. And I thought, I mean, anyway, I could pull it up and tell you, I thought Larry was a 3 year guy, and I thought there was a couple, but anyway, nevertheless. But did you know? You may already know this. This blew my mind because I didn't. When we say Mahar was founded in 1977, that means Beth High was founded in 1977, not Mahar. Mahar was founded in 1985. But the seven people who founded Beth High to be a Greater Washington area branch of Sherwin-Wine's SHJ had a difference of opinion over the same exact thing that separates us and Beth High today,
Yeah.
40 years later. In 1985, and those seven founders, plus some, don't know how many, decided to start something again, reboot, and that was Mahar. And so, like
Yeah.
I was talking to David Wittenberg the other night, and when he joined in 1978, that was Beth High that he joined. Did you know? You knew all this, and this.
Yeah. And I think Peter Wolf was actually president of Beth High at one point, like
Oh, interesting.
the
Yeah.
Beth High organization.
I see.
Um,
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
my understanding is that so there was that letter that went to SHJ in like the very end of 1977. Um,
Oh.
the way SHJ looks at it is basically that letter is the start of Mahar from their perspective, which is where the Mahar is 47 years old bit really comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Is well, that's when SHJ says we affiliated.
Um, all right. Well, Larry knew this too. But I guess I didn't. It was a discovery for me. No,
Yeah.
Larry, you're right. Larry was 2 years, not three. So you might, yeah. Tom Gordon was a 3 year. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Oh, Tom was a 3 year?
Yeah. So here,
Really? Huh.
I can send you this.
Maybe that's why he's not a member anymore.
Um,
He's
so this
just
goes back to
decided.
1993. It's as far back as Larry has it.
Mm.
The presidents go Ann Black, Henrietta Wexler. These are all 1 year. Jules Abrams, Henrietta Wexler again, so that's second year. And then there's a year that he couldn't find out. And then Jocelyn Samuels, 2 years. Ed Golden, 2 years, a year that wasn't recorded. Donna Basin for 1, 2, 3 years.
Really?
Tom Gordon for 1, 2, 3 years. Rick Gold, Nadine. And then I think Rick Gold again, he wasn't sure. Then Nadine, maybe Nadine was a 3 year. I don't know. There's holes in this.
Mm.
Darlene, 2 years. Rachel. Now Rachel was present when we came in. So that, yeah. And then Joy for 3 years. Joy was 3 years. I didn't realize.
Was she?
2016, 17, 17, 18, 18, 19. Larry 2 years, Elaine 3. Anyway, I digress. So I'm planning to do that. So yeah. So what can you think of anything that would be left that would be good for me to say, or will you have said it by then?
I
Uh,
think it's
um,
I think it's likely that I'll have said most of it
yeah.
because it really is kind of you know, welcome. I hope I get a chance to meet you if we haven't met before. We're glad to be back at Cedar Lane. Bathrooms are toward the back. There's some downstairs, there's some upstairs, there's an elevator, um, all of that kind of stuff. Um, it's always been so strange to me that we do any kind of introduction at all because just who introduces high holiday services, I guess. I don't, it's like not,
Um,
not my level of experience with it. And it always felt very strange to be introduced because I'm just me.
yeah.
There's
Okay. So then